In Leviticus 18:18, Yahweh would instruct Moses to instruct all of Israel. You must not take a woman in marriage and then marry her sister as a rival wife while she is still alive, to have sexual relations with her. Of all the commandments that we see in the law, we actually see very powerfully and vividly illustrated exactly why this law was put in place when we consider the situation and condition of Leah and Rachel with Jacob. Thanks for joining us today as we continue to explore the cloud of witnesses, and today we're going to consider what we can know about Leah and Rachel. Rachel and Leah we learn about in Genesis chapters 29 through 35 primarily, with a few little things later on in the Genesis text. They are the daughters of Laban. Laban is Rebekah's brother. Therefore, Laban is the uncle of Jacob, and therefore Leah and Rachel are Jacob's first cousins. They all would have lived probably in the early 20th century BCE. Based upon all the different chronologies that we have here in the Bible, and the customs that are being portrayed very much are consistent with that time period. Jacob is probably around 70 years old, what we can work out based upon all of the chronological information we're given in Genesis, when he comes to the land of Padan Aram, Aram Naharaim, up there in Haran, where Abraham had originally come from. We don't know anything about the ages of Leah and Rachel. All we know is that Leah is older than Rachel. We don't know by how much. We don't know what kind of age spread there is, although we probably would not be unwise to imagine there is some age gap between Jacob and them, since they are unmarried, they're still in the house of their father, and the text does not indicate that there's any kind of extraordinary situation when it comes to how they gave birth. So they are in their father's house, and Jacob comes, and Jacob has been sent to the house of Laban for the purpose of escaping his brother Esau and to take a wife from one of Laban's daughters. And so he meets Rachel at the well. Rachel goes, tells Laban. Laban comes and gets Jacob, brings him in. And we are told in verse 16 of chapter 29 that Laban had two daughters. The older one was named Leah and the younger one Rachel. Leah's eyes were tender, but Rachel had a lovely figure and beautiful appearance. Tender here is a Hebrew rakot. We don't know exactly what it's getting at. Tender, weak, something like that. Since we don't even know what we're getting at, we don't know exactly how to characterize it. All we can tell you is that aesthetically, Rachel was more pleasing. And we're told that Jacob fell in love with Rachel and offered to work for the ability to marry her. And Laban said that that was a fair thing. And so, because Jacob loved Rachel, Jacob worked 7 years for her. And then the wedding came. It was a great wedding. And in the morning, Jacob wake up, and behold, it was Leah. And this has been the butt of all kinds of jokes. You wake up and, oh, there was Leah, right? But this is a situation where we cannot blame Jacob. Jacob never intended or asked to marry Leah. This is the duplicity and chicanery of Laban. Laban will justify himself, saying, well, it's not the custom to marry the younger before the older, so here's what we'll do. You take the bridal week for this one, then we'll let you marry Rachel if you work another 7 years. It may be a custom, but that was never part of the term and agreement. We can only imagine how Jacob must have felt. We can only imagine how Leah must have felt. Leah, this is the way Leah gets married. This is the way Leah is going to enter a household. It's under this ruse. It's in a duplicitous way. It's not something that she asked for or wanted or had any say in. And Jacob, when seeing her, will always be reminded of that duplicity of his father-in-law. Keeping all that in mind, when we look at how Jacob is going to treat his two wives, we should always at least remember that he could have been a lot worse to Leah than he ended up being. So Leah, but not only Leah, but was given the female slave Zilpah as her slave. And then the next week after that, he married Rachel, and Rachel was also given Bilhah, her female slave. And so now Jacob is married to both Leah and to Rachel, not because he asked for it, that was the ruse of his father-in-law, and now he's going to have his household. And then in chapter 29 into 30, we get an idea of the dynamic going on between Leah and Rachel. This is where we really get to know Leah and Rachel in this story. Because Leah is unloved, Rachel is beloved. Jacob knows this, Leah and Rachel know this, Yahweh knows this. And so we're told that Rachel remained infertile for a while, but Leah started bearing children. And we can hear the cry in Leah's voice based upon the names. She has 4 sons in quick succession. Her first son she names Reuben. For she said, Yahweh has looked with pity on my oppressed condition. Surely my husband will love me now. Her second son, because Yahweh heard I was unloved, gave me this one too, named him Simeon, or hears. She became pregnant again. Now this time my husband will show me affection, she says, because I have given birth to 3 sons to him. Levi, or joined. She became pregnant again, and she praised Yahweh, and his name was Yehudah. So Rachel sees that she can't give children. Rachel is the favored wife, and Rachel knows she's the favored wife, but we got to know there is a little bit of predicament there that you could technically divorce her since she's not providing children. And so listen to Rachel's attitude. She is jealous of her sister, and she just demands out of Jacob, give me children or I'll die. And Jacob gets angry at her. Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children? So then Rachel, only 2 generations or 3 generations divorced from Sarah, gives Bilhah, her female slave, to Jacob to have proxy children through her. We're in Mesopotamia. We're not that long after these times. This is still a prevailing custom here. Notice how Rachel treats the names of the children Bilhah bears. Since Bilhah is her female slave and slave proxy wife, she's naming the children. So the first child is born, the first son, and she says, God has vindicated me. He has responded to my prayer and given me a son. He was named Dan. He judges, he vindicates. The second son, Rachel says, I have fought a desperate struggle with my sister, and I have won. And so she named him Naphtali, or my struggle. Is Leah struggling here with Rachel in this sense? Leah is not struggling with Rachel. None of this has anything to do with Rachel. Leah would just love for her husband to love and honor her a little bit. But Rachel's in this war with her sister, so to speak. When Leah sees she's not bearing, then Leah does the same thing, gives Zilpah, her slave, to Jacob. And notice the names now. First son, oh, this is fortunate. His name is Gad. Second son, oh, happy, Asher. Then we have perhaps the saddest story of all, beginning in verse 14 of chapter 30, where Reuben, the firstborn of Leah, finds some mandrakes. Mandrakes, nice fruit, known for aphrodisiac purposes. He brings it back to Leah. Rachel sees it, wants some. Can I have some of your son's mandrakes? And Leah's response, wasn't it enough that you've taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes too? And so Rachel said, because of that, he can go to bed with you tonight for some of your mandrakes. And so Jacob comes into the field, and Leah comes and meets him and says, I have paid for your services with my son's mandrakes. She is married to this man, but she basically had to prostitute herself out for the price of these mandrakes to have him come and be with her. That's the level that we're at here. And Leah becomes pregnant from this liaison. She becomes pregnant. The name of the child is Issachar, which means a reward, which we might think is involving the fact that she has given the mandrakes and this is her reward. Leah's own terms, God has granted me reward because I gave my servant to my husband as a wife. We're not even touching that. We're noting it's there. We're not even touching that. Leah gets pregnant again. And she says, God has given me a good gift. Now my husband will honor me because I have given him 6 sons. She named him Zebulun for honor. And she also gave birth to Dinah. Now finally, after all of this, almost after 14 years, now Rachel gets pregnant, and she bears a son. And what does she call the son that she bears? Yosef. May he multiply or add. In having one son, she's basically asked for more sons. So we kind of get a character study here now on Leah and Rachel. Rachel, people seem to favor, they kind of grant Jacob's conceit, but here she doesn't turn out so well, does she? She's the favored wife, but all she can focus on is her insecurities, what she doesn't have. And her sister has sons and she doesn't. And so she wants them. She imagines herself in this contest with her sister. This is also very much a younger sister acting like there's a competition with the older sister that the older sister doesn't think is a competition, because that's not the way the older sister's treating it. Meanwhile, we see Leah, who is there honoring the God of Jacob, petitioning the God of Jacob, seeing that the God of Jacob is blessing her, wishing and yearning that her husband had regard for her, but is still unloved, still not as honored as Rachel. But after all this, it's interesting that we see the internal dynamics. Then we see the way it works with the external dynamics. Because after this point, it's now been 14 years. Jacob's been working for 21. And now things are changing. The situation's not good. And so Jacob calls out in chapter 31 Leah and Rachel to meet him in the field, because God has told him it's time to go back to Canaan. And so he's kind of feeling them out. Where are you at about this? How do you feel about this possibility? Leaving everything you've ever known, coming with me to Canaan. And so he talks to them about what the God's dream and all the situation. He lays out what ways Laban, their father, has cheated him. And it's interesting to hear their response in verse 14 of chapter 31. Then Rachel and Leah replied to him, "Do we still have any portion or inheritance in our father's house? Hasn't he treated us like foreigners? He not only sold us, but completely wasted the money paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God has snatched away from our father belongs to us and to our children. So now do everything God has told you." A lot of important things to note here. First of all, notice they speak with one voice. This is Leah and Rachel. They speak together. Whatever they have going on between them, in the face of this external issue, something that affects all of them, they speak with one voice. And what is that one voice? They realize they've been alienated from their father's household. They reckon themselves as having been sold, which makes sense because they pretty much were. For 14 years of their husband's labor, they were sold to their husband. And this is one of the times we start seeing what some of the women actually think about their plight, actually think about their condition. And we can recognize that. We can see how they would have felt to have been sold. And to see their father wasting it all, either wasting it because God has actually been providing the blessing to Jacob, and the blessing keeps redounding back to Jacob, or because Laban went out and was profligate with all the resources he was gaining because of the work that Jacob was doing. And so they reckon that, yes, that God had been providing for them through all the things Jacob had been doing, and so they now entrust themselves to him and to his God to do what God has told you to do. And so this is when they decide to leave. So we can see here that Rachel and Leah are completely on board with Jacob. They've tied themselves to Jacob, not their father. They have tied themselves to Jacob's God. And so the time is going to come and they're going to leave. But there's one thing Rachel does as they're about to leave. She goes and steals her father's teraphim, the household gods. This is something throughout the ancient world that's very important in all kinds of ancient societies, these household gods. Where, yeah, you've got the pantheon of gods, but each household's going to have its individual gods. Maybe a champion god, maybe a lesser god that they are honoring because they think that God's going to protect them uniquely in their family. Rachel might be doing this out of spite, likely thinking that these gods that have protected Laban's household will be taken to protect them as they leave for Canaan. Remember, Terah was an idolater. Laban, for all we know, is an idolater. So would Leah and Rachel before they became part of Jacob's house. So this behavior is not entirely surprising, but it's going to come with difficulty. Because when Laban meets Jacob and confronts him, says, "Why did you steal my gods?" Jacob says in verse 32 of chapter 31, "Whoever has taken your gods will be put to death. In the presence of our relatives, identify whatever is yours and take it." For Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. And we can see how Rachel is definitely Laban's daughter, because Laban's trying to find them. Rachel's hidden them under her camel's saddle, and when he comes to her, she says, "I can't get up for you, father. The way of women, i.e. my period, is upon me." Whether that's true or not. And thus Laban never found his gods. And so they get Laban's blessing, and they separate, and Jacob's committed to not marrying anyone else other than Leah and Rachel for the rest of his life. The next scene that we see Leah and Rachel in is when we're preparing to meet Esau. We don't know if it's going to go well or not. So Jacob has it ordered by his own priorities. The first people out in front are the slave wives and their 4 children, then Leah and her 7 children, then finally Rachel and Joseph in the back. Just in case we wondered if anybody didn't know their place in the family, they now know it, because this is a situation where you want to be further back. Because if there was hostility, the first to fall would be the slave women and their children, then Leah, and then only at the end would Rachel and Joseph come to any harm. Regardless, thankfully, the meeting went peacefully with Esau and things were well, but everybody would have known where they stood, although that was probably not news by this point. The next major thing we see is in chapter 35. God has summoned Jacob to go back to Bethel and to dedicate the covenant there. Tells the family to get rid of all their household gods and things. He's probably found out what Rachel has done by then. On their way back, Rachel's going through hard labor. Rachel's gotten what she's wanted. She's giving birth to another son. But it would be the death of her, literally. She's dying as she gives birth. At her last breath, she names the child Benoni, the son of my sorrow. Not an auspicious name. Jacob will immediately change it to Benjamin, son of the right hand, and Rachel dies. And Rachel is there buried on the side of the road there leading to Bethlehem, to Ephrath. This is where Jeremiah will later speak of Rachel crying for her children from Ramah, talking more about Benjamin and Joseph and how they've been taken to exile and are no more. In Jeremiah's passage, that's an encouragement that no, they're going to be restored. Matthew's going to take it and apply it to the killing of the innocents in Bethlehem, since that is where Rachel's tomb is nearby. And Rachel's tomb will be a monument that was known well after this event. And that's the end of Rachel. We don't know exactly when that takes place. We don't hear anything more about Leah either. All that we know is in Genesis chapter 49, when Jacob is encouraging his children to bury him in the cave of Machpelah. He says, there he buried Leah. So Leah dies at some point before the Israelite sojourn. So that's the story of Leah and Rachel. They're otherwise mentioned as demonstrations of fertility in Ruth 4:11, that may Ruth be fertile like them, because they're the ones who built up the house of Israel. So we've seen how Rachel may have been favored, but she's not the greatest example. We've seen how they work very well together. But let's consider Leah. Poor Leah, right? She got the short end of the stick in every way. He's the eldest, but not the prettiest. Always not favored. Always unloved. We can only imagine how she felt, constantly being reminded the only reason she's married this guy is because of the duplicity of her father, that when Jacob looked at her, he would remember that duplicity, that she bore him all these sons, just wanting his love, wanting his honor. And even after his death, Rachel's death, watching Joseph get favored and not her own sons, must have been hard on her. But in the end, she's the one who gets vindicated, because Yahweh vindicates her. Because think about what happens in death. She is buried in the cave of Machpelah, and Jacob is buried with her. And they rest there in the cave of Jacob's ancestors. And Leah is there with Jacob without her rival, who was buried on the side of the road in Bethlehem. And ultimately, David, and of course the great son of David, Jesus, do not come from the line of Rachel through Joseph or Benjamin. They are descendants of Judah and Leah. And so in the end, Leah does get her vindication, because she put her trust in the God of Jacob, and the God of Jacob vindicated her. This is what we learn about Leah and Rachel. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Ethan. I work at the Adventist Church of Christ. We are disciples making disciples in Los Angeles. If you have any questions about anything that we've talked about in terms of Leah and Rachel, we'd love to hear them. Please let us know in the comments and subscribe to us. If we can be of any further service in any matter, please let us know by visiting us at AdventistChurchOfChrist.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. And may the Lord bless and keep you until we're able to meet again.